Joyce, extensively on James Joyce, as well as on Emily Dickinson, including a 2019 essay on Dickinson's lyric ornithology in the Emily Dickinson Journal. Both talks today touch on what Dickinson learned from her readings of Shakespeare's dramatic writing about death, especially in Hamlet. Patrick will speak first on the ways Shakespeare's representations of suicide inform Dickinson's poetic references to the subject, and Jeffrey's talk will follow. His paper discusses how structural elements of the songs of death in Hamlet informed Dickinson's distinctive prosody. Before turning things over to Patrick, I want to reiterate some of the ground rules. The panel is 50 minutes long. Both speakers will talk for no more than 20 minutes to leave time for questions at the end. While Patrick and Jeffrey are speaking, please mute your microphone and do not write in the Zoom chat until both presentations are completed. When they're finished, ask questions via chat or use the hand raising button. To keep things moving, I might read Zoom questions myself, or I might ask you to do it. In either case, please wait until I say it's okay to unmute before asking your question. And with that, I will pass things over to Patrick.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to experiment here, see if I can get my screen share. There we go. I'm assuming we can see that then. All right. Well, good afternoon. As my title suggests here, I'd like to talk today about the cheery subject of suicide in Emily Dickinson's poems, which has drawn my attention and calls forth, I think, certain questions about her poetics and how they crisscross with the poetics of one of her literary heroes, William Shakespeare. The speaker of Emily Dickinson's poems can be astonishingly free-thinking about suicide. Even in the 21st century, a poem such as, let's see if I can get it here. Yeah, the poem such as The Right to Perish Might Be Thought makes the bold assertion in its opening lines that a person's right to die is undisputed. However, both society and the universe seek to obstruct this right. Here, I'll read it. The right to perish might be thought an undisputed right, attempted, and the universe upon the opposite will concentrate its officers. You cannot even die, but nature and mankind must pause to pay you scrutiny. Though one might want to die or even feel one has the right to do so, the speaker recognizes that she lives in a world that is antagonistic towards such a right, an antagonism quite similar to the feelings Dickinson's Amherst would have felt. Moreover, this is not simply a passive kind of dying as from illness, but an active one, such as suicide. The poem places great emphasis on the agency of the dying person. It is not only a right, but it is something that needs to be acted out or, quote, attempted. It is only when this attempt is made that others resist this right by judging the person, that is, by paying them scrutiny for violating their laws. In other words, there is a conflict here between moral values, the rights of the individual versus the restrictions of the greater world. This idea of the right to die is repeated in numerous ways throughout Dickinson's body of poems. Sometimes it is even more than a right, it is a necessity, particularly when it comes to ending suffering. In the poem, Death is Like an Insect, the speaker compares death to an insect that has burrowed into a tree. It might be delayed by baiting it or baffling it, at least at first. Death is like the insect menacing the tree, competent to kill it, but decoyed may be. Bait it with the balsam, seek it with the saw, baffle it if it cost you everything you are. However, as the last stanza makes clear, there are times when it is better to give in completely to death, to actively choose it. Then, if it have burrowed out of reach of skill, wring the tree and leave it, 'tis the vermin's will. Rather than leaving death to wreak suffering, there comes a time to, quote, wring the tree and kill it outright mercifully. If there is a reason behind a person's right to die, then this is one of them. The subject of the poem, The Heart Asks Pleasure, first is less allegorical and decidedly more human. But it too describes the slow burrowing of suffering that leads to death. The decline towards death can be seen in the poem's structure. Its opening line describes what the heart asks when it is in the best of conditions, then it gradually adjusts these desires as the conditions get worse and worse. Helen Wendler calls this structure a, quote, ladder of torture. We climb down as we read the poem, starting with a paradise of pleasure at its top and finishing with the sufferings of the persecuted at its bottom. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the privilege to die. When things are at their worst, when no good can be expected out of life or living, then dying becomes a privilege. It is worth noting how in these poems so far, Dickinson uses legal, even constitutional language to describe one's decision to die. It is a right, a privilege, and a liberty, which is one of Dickinson's alternates to the word privilege in her manuscript. There's also a strong sense of inevitability to this poem, the repetition of and then, not only suggesting the descending degrees of human suffering that lead to death, but also suggesting the inexorable tick-tocking of time that brings us closer each moment to such a fatal decision. Not unlike the insect of death that must be put up with until it is out of reach and then is surrendered to with the ringing of the tree. Where might such ideas about suicide come from? The poem certainly clashed with the congregationalist Christianity of Dickinson's upbringing and community, which explicitly condemned self-murder as a sin punished with damnation. John Calvin, it might be noted, believed that suicide was usually caused by demonic possession. That Dickinson, a poet who consistently questioned the principles of her society, would have entertained rebellious notions does not surprise anyone who has read her. And she might simply have conceived them on her own, particularly when seeing the dying or the invalid, as her mother was for many years, suffering in the worst kinds of pain. Still, it is worth asking, what literary or philosophical models she might have drawn from to illuminate her way. The works of Shakespeare, whom Dickinson cherished, must have been particularly liberating on this subject. By my own count, there are at least 13 suicides dramatized in Shakespeare's plays. And this does not count Lucrece's suicide in his poem, The Rape of Lucrece, Gloucester's attempted suicide in King Lear, Hamlet's long soliloquies on suicide, or even the comically performed self-murders of Pyramus and Thisbe in the play within a play of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Suicide, in short, was both common and brooded on in many of Shakespeare's works, often being one of the major themes. And when we consider the arguments persuasively made by Pádraic Finnerty that Dickinson identified herself with Cleopatra and Othello, two suicides, it is not hard to see how Shakespeare might have given her the license to write about this forbidden subject. Dickinson's favorite play, some evidence suggests, was Antony and Cleopatra. And if the wear and tear on her copy of Shakespeare reveals anything, it is that some of its most read passages were the play's final acts, in which the two grand eponymous characters contrive to kill themselves, both for the sake of their mutual love and to avoid the humiliations of captivity. But we do not need to examine the physical condition of Dickinson's books to see how Shakespeare influenced her thoughts about suicide. There are clear traces of such an influence in her poems. For instance, the speaker of Did You Ever Stand in a Cavern's Mouth describes a suffering that leads to a question strikingly similar to Hamlet's famous question about suicide. Here the speaker asks her audience if they have ever felt agony, so much agony that they have asked the question of whether or not they should die. Did you ever stand in a cavern's mouth, widths out of the sun, and look and shudder and block your breath, and deem to be alone in such a place, what horror, how goblin it would be, and fly as 'twere pursuing you? Then loneliness looks so. Did you ever look in a cannon's face, between whose yellow eye and yours the judgment intervened, the question of to die, extemporizing in your ear as cool as satyrs' drums? If you remember and were saved, it's like or so, it seems. Dickinson boldly alludes to Hamlet's oft-quoted to be or not to be question, even using quotes herself to emphasize it. Like Hamlet in his soliloquy, the speaker does not dismiss the idea of killing oneself. If anything, she treats it as a real possibility. The last line suggesting that anyone reading this has been saved, but that others, perhaps those who let the question extemporize too wildly in their ear, like the frenzy of a satyr's drums, have not survived. With similar allusions to Hamlet, the speaker of "Me prove it now, whoever doubt," is an Ophelia-like character who wades into water to drown herself as a sign of her love to her beloved. Ophelia, if we recall, is wooed early on in the play by Hamlet, who professes to her that she might, quote, "doubt the sun doth move, but never doubt his love for her." Later, of course, he spurns her, insinuating she has betrayed him. And though her motives are debatable, Shakespeare seems to make them intentionally ambiguous. It has been a long-standing popular interpretation that she drowns herself in a brook out of grief for him. Dickinson Speaker not only captures the imagery and drama of this moment, the speaker gradually becomes engulfed in the water, just as Ophelia does, but even adopts, it even adopts Shakespearean archaisms such as dost and thee. And she also immediately recalls the issue of, quote, doubt that existed between Hamlet and Ophelia. "Me prove it now, whoever doubt, me stop to prove it now. Make haste the scruple, death be scant for opportunity. The river reaches to my feet, and yet my heart be dry. O lover, life could not convince, might death enable thee. The river reaches to my breast, still my hands above, proclaim with their remaining might, dost recognize the love? The river reaches to my mouth, remember when the sea swept by my searching eyes, the last themselves were quick with thee." But though the imagery and the method of death are reminiscent of Ophelia, the grand romantic tone of the poem is reminiscent of the melodramatic Cleopatra, particularly when she kills herself to demonstrate her love for Antony and to join him in death. Cleopatra's words to the dead Antony, in fact, make a strikingly similar argument to the one Dickinson speakers make. "Husband, I come," Cleopatra says. "Now to that name my courage prove my title." Cleopatra, that is, kills herself in part to prove her love, just as Dickinson's speaker feels that she must prove her feelings to her lover. Seeing the Shakespearean allusions in "Me Prove It Now" makes them easier to see in the poem, "What If I Cannot Wait?" where another speaker proposes, with the exuberance of Cleopatra, how she can show her love with suicide. Her description of filing this mortal off is reminiscent of Hamlet's "to be or not to be" speech when he considers shuffling the mortal coil off. And the image of the speaker waiting in liberty recalls Ophelia's method of suicide. The poem reads, "What if I say I shall not wait? What if I burst the fleshly gate and pass escaped to thee? What if I file the mortal off and see where it hurt me? That's enough, and wade in liberty. They cannot take me anymore, dungeons can call and guns implore, unmeaning now to me, as laughter was an hour ago, or laces, or a traveling show, or who died yesterday." More than anything else, what really stands out about this poem is its unapologetic joy towards self-murder. Except for the fact that it is stated in conditional terms, what if, there is no trace of reluctance towards suicide here. Death would only be a, quote, liberty, like the other poem, from the dungeons and guns and distractions of the world. As a final example, Dickinson uses another Shakespearean tragedy, King Lear, in her poem, echoes another Shakespearean tragedy, King Lear, in her poem, This Merit Hath the Worst, by recalling Edgar's words about the strange consolation one can take when reaching one's lowest point. Edgar, who has been framed for conspiring against his father, Gloucester, flees to the wild heaths of England to live as a beggar named Poor Tom. Having been betrayed by his half-brother, hunted by his father, and brought to the abject poverty and exposure of living on the wild heath, he understandably believes he has come to his life's nadir. To be worst, he tells himself at the start of Act 4, to be, quote, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune means that one lives not in fear, because any change at all would be an improvement. He assures himself that, quote, the worst returns to laughter. Of course, in a moment of great irony, Edgar is no sooner saying these words than he sees his own father, Gloucester, walking toward him with his eyes plucked out and seeking a place to kill himself. Observing this, Edgar realizes his mistake, declaring, "The worst is not so long as we can say, this is the worst." That is, whoever is alive and well enough to complain about their condition has not yet experienced the worst. A good life lesson for us all. From its first lines, Dickinson's poem takes up the theme of the worst, though reworking it in some telling ways. What is good about the worst, according to the speaker, is that it cannot be repeated or lead to more misery. Once someone has come to their very lowest point, experiencing the extreme of bad fortune, then one can take some solace or take a pause and a breath and glance securely round them. But if this sounds as though the speaker makes the same mistake as Edgar, then the last two lines of the poem surprise us by accepting, even embracing, one's death utterly. This merit hath the worst, it cannot be again, when fate hath taunted last and thrown her furthest stone. The maimed may pause and breathe and glance securely round. The deer attract no further than it resists the hound. The image of the deer at the end, hunted as Edgar is hunted in King Lear, has come to the place of its death and accepted it. It no longer attracts worse fortune, the hound, once it stops resisting it. Dickinson's meaning here is emphasized by her alternatives for resists, which are evades and eludes. Only when someone has given up completely can they, ironically, have enough pause to glance securely round and evade suffering. Dickinson might be seen here as taking her cue from Shakespeare, applying the lesson Edgar has to learn so cruelly by seeing his blinded father. Taken together with the other poems, this merit hath the worst suggests that death is sometimes the most desirable choice, a privilege or even a right that grants them security and liberty. Now, it hardly seems worth mentioning at this point that it would be a mistake to read these poems as speaking directly for Dickinson's own personal views. First, Dickinson's poetry and letters reveal her as a person in love with life, not death, and few poets show the appreciation for this life on earth that Dickinson shows. Second, as even the handful of poems I have discussed demonstrate, she enjoyed experimenting with a variety of tones, perspectives, and beliefs. Instead, it is far more useful to see her poems as a platform, like Shakespeare's stage, for dramatizing ideas and personalities, giving performances not unlike the electrifying theatrical Cleopatra whom she admired. This extends too to her reading of Shakespeare. Dickinson found in his plays, perhaps more than any other writer, a topography on which she could explore ethical and spiritual taboos. It might be argued then that Dickinson meets Shakespeare on this topography of taboos, giving her a place not only to hear voices in his writing that challenge the traditional morals of her society, but to give herself such voices in her writing. To conclude, or to open up more thought, I hope, I would argue that the most salient quality of these voices is their transgressiveness. Dickinson speakers gain, quote, liberty by embracing death and moving beyond conventional boundaries, inhabiting places that good 19th century Christian women were not allowed to inhabit. In this respect, the ostensibly morbid topic of suicide is actually revitalizing and liberating. Asserting one's right to choose death, or more accurately, one's right to choose between life and death, allows Dickinson to see and say things that she could not have done otherwise. It is in this same transgressive attitude towards death that allows her to describe dying people so powerfully and honestly, as she does in the poems, I've Seen a Dying Face and I Like a Look of Agony, or that gives her the permission to speak as the dead, as she does in the poems, Because I Could Not Stop for Death and I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce. One of Dickinson's many poetic gifts was to reach out to the very limits of what she called her circumference, sometimes even pointing beyond that circumference. And these poems on suicide show her willingness to traverse both the moral the moral limits of her society and the mortal limits of human existence. And that's it. Thank you.
Should I just go ahead then? Gerald?
Sorry, I thought that I had unmuted myself. I was speaking. Yes, would you please go ahead, Jeffrey? Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Before I present my paper, I'd like to make clear that it has benefited greatly from other readers. The title of the paper is Dickinson's Prosodic Music and the Songs on Death in Hamlet. The paper adopts the following premise. When Dickinson read the works of Shakespeare, the closest model she found for her own lyric art arose in the short-line rhyme verse in the English poet's plays. The conclusion I draw in the paper is that the language of Hamlet, and specifically its songs on death, emboldened Dickinson to develop her prosodic music. The paper unfolds in 3 steps. Dickinson's prosodic music, the common day of lyric, the evidence of Dickinson's Hamlet. In the time available, I'll outline the ideas and the sorts of evidence in each of these 3 steps. The paper's first step, Dickinson's prosodic music, makes clear at the start what I argue Shakespeare influenced, Dickinson's prosody. I take this prosody to entail the phonemes of rhyme and other echoes, the syllables of rhythm and meter, and the phrases of intonation tied to a speaker's thought and often deep emotion. Given these elements of prosody, I take Dickinson's prosodic music to arise in distinctive word arrangements that show 3 features: interlaced phonic echoes, the rhythms of predominantly short-lined verse where rhyme marks stanzas, and the motions of intonation set within or falling across verse lines. I evidence Dickinson's prosodic music in this first step by reading the poem draft When What They Sung For Is Undone, one of the poet's envelope poems. About 1881, and on the inside of an envelope the poet had received from her cousin Louisa Norcross, Dickinson wrote about the vanishing of life and the permanence of song. In his typographical layout of the draft, R.W. Franklin sets its first 2 sentences in an 8886 stanza that rhymes tune with stone. When what they sung for is undone, who cares about a bluebird's tune? Why, resurrection had to wait till they had moved a stone. In the intonation of her ponderative why, set in the stanza just below when and who, the speaker here seems to reason that if faith in resurrection had to wait for an angel to move a heavy stone, then belief in a bluebird's lasting song would depend on less. In the draft's prosodic music, interlaced phonic echoes enhance sung, undone, and a bluebird's tune, while the slant rhyme of tune with stone suggests the permanence of song in its pun on tombstone. This first stanza is followed in Franklin's layout of the draft by 2 couplets that together form an 8686 common measure stanza. This second stanza develops the speaker's thought on death, moving from the sound of a bluebird's tune to the sound of a beating drum. As if a drum went on and on to captivate the slain, I dare not write until I hear intro without my trans. The endless sound imagined here, the beating of a drum, seems to lead the slain to life, a thought related to resurrection that is momentous enough. But I'm also struck by the 2 verse lines that follow, where the lyric speaker names herself for the first time in the poem. I dare not write until I hear intro without my trans. These lines read as a miniature Ars Poetica. The first line, a pulsing iambic tetrameter, has equal prosodic beats on dare, write, and hear, and balances at either end of the line, I dare, with I hear. In a hermeneutic key to Dickinson's lyric art, the speaker says she dares to write only when she hears. The first step of this paper continues by reflecting on the short-lined rhyme stanza as a primary form in Dickinson's lyric art. I believe that Dickinson was emboldened to develop her lyric art by her reading of Shakespeare, where she found distinctive word arrangements in abundance, along with models for her lyric forms. Akin in prosody to Dickinson's own, these models of short line rhyme verse must have caught the Amherst poet's eye. It is in Dickinson's reading of Hamlet that I seek this tenable influence. Let's move to step 2, the common day of lyric. The clearest direct evidence that Shakespeare influenced Dickinson's lyric art is drama's vitalist expression is the common day. The poem reads, drama's vitalist expression is the common day that arise and set about us. Other tragedy perish in the recitation. This the best enact when the audience is scattered and the box is shut. Hamlet to himself were Hamlet, had not Shakespeare wrote. Though the Romeo left no record of his Juliet, it were infinite enacted in the human heart, only theater recorded, owner cannot shut. The largest pattern in this poem is the lexis of drama and theater, which opens with the superlative drama's vitalist expression. This lexis opposes two sorts of tragedy. One sort is recited on the stage and instanced by the three Shakespeare characters named. A second sort of tragedy is beyond performance. This superlative tragedy, drama's vitalist expression, is the common day that arise and set about us time and again. In another superlative, this sort of tragedy, the best enact when the audience is scattered and the box is shut. And this tragedy occurs in the common day of lyric. Lyric is the space of its articulation. By opposing two sorts of tragedy and comparing implicitly two genres, drama's vitalist expression gives a second hermeneutic key to Dickinson's lyric art, one that reveals how she understood lyric poetry. The common day of lyric is brief, solitary, and inner, and not least, the common day of lyric has its own prosodic music. We hear in drama's vitalist expression interlaced phonic echoes, especially in though the Romeo left no record, it were infinite enacted in the human heart, and the reverse rhyme of only with owner. Rhyme marks the design of the four stanzas, especially the mosaic thematizing rhyme of common day with tragedy. We also see the move in English prosody from long line to short line verse. The first stanza has only 3 verse lines, the first of which neatly divides into 8-5 hemistichs to form the same 8-5-8-5 trochaic common measure throughout the poem. The motions of intonation, cued by sentence type, foreground the opposition between the two sorts of tragedy and the vitalist expression that is the poem's topic. Alone in its contrastive intonation, the demonstrative pronoun in this, the best enact, points through ellipsis back to the common day. Taken together, these features, interlaced phonic echoes, short line rhyme verse in stanzas, and the motions of intonation compose the prosodic music distinctive to Dickinson's lyric art. Written about 1863, drama's vitalist expression foreshadows Shakespeare's deepening influence in the more than 2 decades to follow. After Dickinson's grave eye illness, her 2 sojourns for treatment in Boston in 1864 and 1865, and her identification then of Shakespeare as the poet of poets. Let's move to step 3, the evidence of Dickinson's Hamlet. The conclusion that the language of Hamlet emboldened Dickinson to develop her lyric art draws on the poet's references to Shakespeare over more than 4 decades, from 1845, when she was 14, to just a few weeks before her death on May 15, 1886. Given my focus on Hamlet and on its songs on death, I established 3 categories in Dickinson's reference to Shakespeare and to the play. These are the categories on the screen: a writer's reverence, one poet's love for the work of another, paronomasia and the resonance of linguistic play, distinctive word arrangement. I only have time to mention one facet of the copious evidence, 11 allusions to Hamlet and 8 others to Shakespeare, arranged in these 3 categories. In the second category, paronomasia and the resonance of linguistic play, a pattern points to the songs on death in Hamlet. The pattern includes the quotation in an 1885 letter to Elizabeth Holland of Crowner's quest. The quoted phrase in Hamlet is spoken by the gravedigger, who early in Act 5 refers to Crowner's quest law, a slip of the tongue for coroner's inquest, as justification for Ophelia's Christian burial. The pattern also includes 2 other references to Ophelia's death. An 1880 letter, also to Elizabeth Holland, quotes the phrase, "an envious sliver," and a letter in 1885 to Abby C. Farley, a niece of Otis P. Lord, locates the quote in Hamlet. "An envious sliver broke was a passage your uncle peculiarly loved in the drowning Ophelia." The 2 envious sliver quotes foreground the play's depiction of Ophelia when she fell into the weeping brook, where her songs end with her death. Step 3 of the paper goes on to read the songs on death in Hamlet. These songs serve as reference points by which to recognize Dickinson's prosodic music in 2 poems, an 1860 elegy for Charlotte Bronte, All Overgrown by Cunning Moss, and an 1876 encomium, Praise It, 'Tis Dead. I first looked at 3 of Ophelia's songs. These 3 songs read, "He is dead and gone, lady, he is dead and gone. At his head a grass-green turf, at his heels a stone. White his shroud as the mountain snow, larded with sweet flowers, which be wept to the grave did not go with true love showers. They bore him barefaced on the bier, hey non nonny nonny, hey nonny, and on his grave rains many a tear." These stanzas gather verse from contemporary songs and ballads. The stanzas all draw on proverbial motifs of death and mourning, and all bear interlaced phonic echoes in short-lined, rhymed verse. The first stanza, marked by its rhyme of gone with stone, foregrounds the catalectic 7-5-7-5 common measure by means of refrain and anaphora. With the exception of the vocative lady, which is addressed to Gertrude, the stanza is monosyllabic, and its trochaic rhythm matches the falling intonation of its declarative sentences. The second stanza doubles its alternate rhymes of snow with go and flowers with showers, but is metrically less regular. Scholars believe the particle not, which goes against the meter and the expected sense in which be wept to the grave did not go, is Ophelia's allusion to her father's expedient burial. In the third fragment, alliteration foregrounds the first verse line, and between the rhyme of beer with tear, the hey non nonny refrain, bleakly out of place, shows that the song is incomplete. Ophelia's songs and her alliterative phrase, a grass-green turf, bring to mind the grave and the phrase, Yorkshire hills are green, in Dickinson's 1860 elegy for Charlotte Bronte, All Overgrown by Cunning Moss. Written before Dickinson's identification of Shakespeare as the poet of poets, the elegy's first sequence of 3 stanzas reads, "All overgrown by cunning moss, all interspersed with weed, the little cage of cur bell in quiet Haworth laid. This bird, observing others, when frost too sharp became, retire to other latitudes, quietly did the same, but differed in returning, since Yorkshire hills are green, yet not in all the nests I meet can nightingale be seen. Dickinson's prosodic music is emboldened here in ways that are more inventively resonant than Ophelia's songs, and in ways that are consonant with her elegies' subversive meanings. Consider the first stanza's slant rhyme of weed with laid. Instead of a grass-green turf marked by a stone, as in Ophelia's first song, we see a grave all overgrown by cunning moss, all interspersed with weed. Rhyme foregrounds the creeping weed, and the attribute in cunning moss, with its sense of calculated guile, is striking. Rather than a tidy resting place, we see a tangled sprawl of unruly vegetation, wet, spongy moss and weed taking over the grave. Related common measure is marked by the anaphora in all overgrown and all interspersed, but more inventive phonic echoes arise in the iambic rhythm of the little cage of Currer Bell in quiet Haworth laid. Alternate rhymes give form to stanzas 2 and 3, but Dickinson has recourse in her second stanza to artful hyperbaton in the service of her rhyme. And in the elegy's largest pattern, Dickinson selects her favorite trope of the poet as songbird, in allusion to Bronte. The speaker, however, subverts the bird's return, and with it the elegy's expectation of consolation, when she ends by saying, "Since Yorkshire hills are green, yet not in all the nests I meet can nightingale be seen." The iambic rhythm and interlaced phonic echoes here are especially resonant, as is the line of assonance that unites green, meet, seen. The resonance underscores the nightingale's absence in the New World setting of Amherst, just as the prior emphasis on quiet does in England, in quiet Haworth laid, and quietly did the same. The Gravedigger Song in Act 5 of Hamlet also serves as a reference point by which to recognize Dickinson's prosodic music. Unlike Ophelia's songs, the Gravediggers has an extant literary source. It is a corrupt version of 3 stanzas from a poem by Thomas Lord Vaux, "The Aged Lover Renounceth Love." 2 of the stanzas the Gravedigger sings are exemplary. "But age with his stealing steps hath caught me in his clutch, and hath shipped me into the land as if I had never been such. A pickaxe and a spade, for and a shrouding sheet, or a pit of clay for to be made, for such a guest is meet." The first stanza personifies age, whose clutch annuls the speaker's supposed amorous talents of youth. This is underscored by the alliterative "stealing steps" and "caught me in his clutch," the alternate rhyme of clutch with such, and the falling intonation of the declarative syntax. The second stanza names the tools of the gravedigger's trade, doubles its alternate rhymes of spade with made and sheet with meat, and has other noteworthy echoes: a shrouding sheet, clay to be made. The Gravedigger's Song is most striking, however, in the setting of its occurrence. As he prepares Ophelia's Christian burial, and in a macabre display of death's impiety, the gravedigger sings as he unearths the skulls of those he has buried before, thus reversing the very process he has newly begun. The Gravedigger Song brings to mind Dickinson's encomium, "Praise It, 'Tis Dead," written about 1876, long after her identification of Shakespeare as the poet of poets. The gravedigger's sensibility, his glib singing as he unearths and tosses skulls through the air, leads to this poem. The poem reads, "Praise it, 'tis dead, it cannot glow. Warm this inclement ear with the encomium it earned, since it was gathered here. Invest this alabaster zest in the delights of dust, remitted since it flitted it in recusance august." Dickinson's prosody is emboldened here in a filigree of phonemic music. Invest this alabaster zest in the delights of dust. A macabre sensibility infuses these verse lines, which convey a bleak and lone materiality of death. What would alabaster zest be? The choice of zest, signaling invigorating relish, is enhanced by its internal rhyme with invest and by its slant rhyme with dust. What are the delights of dust? Praise it, 'tis dead is a eulogy. And after its opening imperative, praise is also manifest in the encomium it earned and in recusant august. We never know, though, just what is died. It may be a bird, given the verb in it flitted it. We only know that the speaker is in the presence of the dead being, for the poem's context of utterance and its context of reference coincide in the deictic pointing of this inclement ear, gathered here, and this alabaster zest. The eulogy is guided by its threefold lyric address, evident in the falling intonation of its three imperatives. Praise it, warm this inclement ear, invest this alabaster zest. These three patterns, praise, deixis, and lyric address, interweave in the prosodic music of the poem's two implied common measure stanzas. The opening two verse lines are dimeters that, when set together, form with the following three verse lines an 8-6-8-6 stanza marked by the rhyme of ear with here. The remaining four verse lines also compose an 8-6-8-6 stanza marked by the rhyme of dust with august. The lyric address in praise it and invest this foregrounds the outset of these two implied stanzas, and the poet's prosodic music is bold in the closing verse lines. Remitted since it flitted it in recusance august. The noun recusance, meaning a refusal to accept received religious belief, and here to conceive a Christian afterlife, is the lexical key to the poem. Taking the songs on death in Hamlet as reference points by which to recognize Dickinson's prosodic music, we see that All Overgrown by Cunning and Praise It, 'Tis Dead exceed Shakespeare's songs in prosodic exuberance. I believe this exuberance, Dickinson's prosodic music, is a primary constituent of her lyric art. In light of the poet's engagement with Hamlet, including the three allusions to the gravedigger and to Ophelia, I infer that the language of Hamlet, and specifically its songs on death, emboldened Dickinson to make her lyric art more inventively resonant. It may be objected here that the sources of Dickinson's prosody are numerous, and that the influence of Shakespeare's language in Hamlet is not conclusive. I believe, though, that the direct evidence of influence in drama's vitalist expression is the common day, along with the copious indirect evidence only touched on in this presentation, lead one to conclude in defeasible argument that the influence of Hamlet on Dickinson's lyric art is especially probable. Ophelia says in her last appearance, and with a pun on rue, you must wear your rue with a difference. The language of Hamlet emboldened Dickinson to wear her rue with a difference, to make her lyric art more inventively resonant, and to set in it her own distinctive word arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I will ask you to either use the reaction button to raise your hand, or you can just put your name in the chat, and I'll call out in the order that names appear. Questions.
There are two who've got their hands up.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Dan, why don't you go first?
Thank you. I had a few things, I guess at least one for each, but I guess what's fresh in my mind, let me ask Jeffrey. when you were talking about drama's vitalist expression is the common day, and you had mentioned some things about possible puns, I couldn't help but think about that common day has embedded in it the word comedy, if it's going to be paired with tragedy. And so if the common day is the comedy of which tragedy is the alternative, then tragedy, now I'm picking up some resonances of other papers I've seen today, and so this may not be relevant to yours, but tragedy is a way of defining a life as, its most magnificent moment. And, we are who we are at our best and at our worst. Whereas comedy diffuses that into a lot of different, into the rising and setting that always happens. And I guess I don't really have a question about that, except to wonder if that's consonant with what you're, with something that you were seeing in that poem.
Thank you for that lovely observation. It had never crossed my mind. And it seems as though, Dickinson, being the extraordinarily intelligent and shrewd poet that she is, it seems wholly reasonable that be there. The tone of the poem seems to tend more towards suffering and as I read it, but nonetheless, thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't seen it at all. Thank you.
Okay. And if I can hold the floor just for 1 second, and then I'm through. If I could ask Patrick, just to say, do you think, or to what extent, if any, do you think that these performances in these poems, some of the poems on suicide at last, is she riffing on Ophelia? Is she really writing them in the voice of Ophelia or Cleopatra? Again, I'm picking something up from earlier papers where, she likes to inhabit Cleopatra or someone in a poem. So are these her own performances loosely invested in some rhetoric from the plays, or is she, as people were arguing about some poems back in the 80s or so, is she really just sort of taking up the voice of a particular moment in a poem and writing her own aria?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a really interesting. I see a landmine or two in my response here.
Trying to lay them.
Ahead of me. Is she? I mean, I guess I'll just try to spot that landmine right now and put a flag on it. Is she plagiarizing in some way here, right, in her performance? I don't know if that's where if that was in any way with the 80s suggestion. I just think of what is his name? It's eluding me now. Who made those kind of claims? But I think honestly, we don't know. I mean, obviously, we can't know those what's going through Dickinson's mind. I can tell you what's going through my mind when I first read these poems, in particular, the poem. Me Prove It Now, when she's sinking into the river gradually. It certainly felt like Ophelia. I couldn't not see it. It was one of the reasons why I ended up taking this paper up, was that poem. It felt like she wanted to, and Dickinson was she wasn't just a great writer, she was a great reader, and that means the imaginative power of really, fully investing herself into these roles. And as other people pointed out, this conference, this was something that she performed individually in the reading group, or she performed for herself, reading them to herself. It wouldn't be hard to imagine her reading Hamlet, for instance, to herself aloud, and that these private documents that were her poems, many of them were maybe also her private rehearsals for some of these ideas, and to kind of setting her own stage. If that crosses into something that might be taking more than contributing, I don't know, but it certainly seems like, I don't know though. Maybe I'm sorry. Maybe I'm being too sensitive to that question, but I think that it seems to me that yeah, she wanted to inhabit these worlds. And Shakespeare, I think we've all probably experienced this, maybe with Shakespeare, certainly with other writers, is the glory of inhabiting those worlds and writing from within them. She changes enough details in the poem too to suggest that she is making it her own. I don't know, is that answering your question? I'm sorry, Dan.
Yeah, I certainly, I was not saying, you know, we've caught her, now we'll, not that at all. I was just wondering what kind of performance you see her doing and what, at what level you see her absorbing the voice of Ophelia. I was about to say, and then we'll move on, or I'm typing that, well, I'll just type it and you please move on. Okay.
Well, yeah, I'd like to say, go ahead.
No, I would like to at least have an opportunity to hear from Eliza before we close. So I don't mean to cut you off.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed your talks. They were wonderful. And I guess I will start with Jeffrey. Jeffrey, so fascinating and so precise. Thank you for leading us through the sonic landscape of the poems. So I'm going to turn to the personal just for a moment. So you know I am deaf, right? And I hear through cochlear implants, and I haven't always been deaf. So I used to be hearing. But that has caused me to really, and because I work on poetry, really think about this constant connection between sound and poetry and the insistence on it. And the kind of, for a while, Dickinson, the Derridian turn pulled people away from sound and orality. And now people are coming back with Chris Miller's book, helped do that, bring us back to attend to orality in Dickinson, among other people, of course. And I've heard a lot about music and Dickinson in this wonderful work in this conference. But I'm estranged now from sound in different ways. And so it makes me think about it a lot. And what I'm thinking about in terms of your presentation, Jeffrey, is the question of silence and Dickinson's distancing herself from music in various ways. And especially in that last striking poem, I think of that as if my being, and being but an ear, and I in silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. That's such a powerful, that phrase is very important to me now. And then for your poem, the word inclement ear buried in that poem suggests that the ear can't hear properly, or that there's a distant sense from music. And I see this now in Dickinson, I think, and I'm wondering what you think about that, a sense of dislocation, especially given her periods of blindness. I wonder what she's thinking about and her sensitivity to music. And the fact that poetry is on the page as well. I just wonder if you have thoughts about that. I know that's a lot.
Well, thank you very much. It was a lot. It was a lot. But thank you so much for your comments. I just would like to say that I think it must be painful for you to have lost your hearing. And I want to acknowledge, or perhaps it is, and if it is painful, I just want to acknowledge that and tell you that I share that pain to the extent that I can, and that I would love to, and that
I know that we've talked about it over the years. It's a genuine question. Dickinson is saturated in musicality, but there's a fascination with silence and not hearing too, that people don't attend to as much. And I was wondering, given the inclement ear, if you had some thoughts about the disruption or dislocation of the lyric speaker from sound.
Well, I just wanted to say that I would love to continue to converse with you in the future about this stuff. And if ever you have a question arises, please feel free to write me, and I would try to, try to contribute something to a good conversation. In terms of silence And the inclement ear. Yes, the inclement ear is highly enigmatic. I mean, my understanding of inclement as an adjective is that it typically modifies the weather, and that something that's sort of, you know, somewhat awry or not. In this case, the speaker is contemplating a dead being. So it's odd. It's an odd choice, odd modification. I can't make more sense of it than that. In terms of silence, I could not agree more. And I have a category of poems that have to do with, I've cataloged a set of poems. I will send it to you that have silence, that refer to silence, because this must, I mean, in a poet who is so extraordinarily attuned to sound, to the sounds of the world, of nature around her, to the sounds of language. I mean, those poems that we've chosen for next year's conference in Seville, often they have to do with hearing language. So I will send you that my collection of poems on silence, and I look forward to speaking with you about this stuff in the future, because I feel just as passionate about it as you do.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I don't want to take up more time because other people have things to say, but Patrick, I just wanted you to know I had a question for you as well. And it had to do with the rise of suicide poems over the course of the century, that culminates in people like E.A. Robinson in the 1890s, who has many, many suicide poems. So I was wondering about the cultural, the literary tradition of suicide poems in America, and the context for Dickens' interest in experimenting with suicidality. But I don't want to take up too much time. So that was, I want you to know that I was also had a question for you. So maybe we can talk by email.
So it is approaching 3 o'clock. Parik, do we have time to ask a couple of questions more, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, just to say that we don't start again until half 3 your time. Okay. So there is more time, and okay. Judith has a question, and I've got a comment. Yeah. So yeah, maybe other people.
Yeah. So why don't we have Judith go next? Thank you.
I have 2 questions. One is related to that last point about the rise of suicide poems over the century, and did that rise indicate a change of cultural attitude towards suicide that might explain Emily Dickinson's focus on the suffering in the later poems as opposed to some of the earlier ones? So that, I guess that's a question for Patrick. And the second question for Jeffrey is, given the 3 lyrical qualities that you were exploring, the phonic echoes and the rhythms of short line verse and the notations of intonation, I'm assuming that you would find those in a lot of poems. And did you choose these poems about death because they were heightened in those poems? I'm just curious about that.
Should I go, or Patrick? What should we do?
I guess go ahead,
Jeffrey.
Patrick is pointing to you, Jeffrey.
Okay. Let's see. Well, thank you, Judith, for the questions. I did choose the last 2 Dickinson poems because of their theme, but yes, also especially Praise It 'Tis Dead, because of its heightened, really heightened, phonic or phonological properties. I mean, the invest this alabaster zest with the delights of dust. I mean, it's a pretty amazing sequence. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm persuaded that Dickinson is constantly choosing her word selection, constantly has to do with finding innovative echoes among those words that she combines. So her ear is constantly looking for that. But it's an ear that looks not only for such resonance, but for inventive combinations of words. I mean, I think of Roman Jakobson speaking about I like Ike, and that I like Ike is as a slogan for a president, you know, is just as resonant in its phonemes as what we might find in a poem, but it's, you know, utterly banal or, you know, of no interest to us pretty much today. Whereas Dickinson's combinations of words are so highly inventive and, you know, extraordinary. That's what gives them their magic, their semantic magic. The idea is that one can't just go to the sound. One needs to go to the sound as it relates to the meanings of the words that are joined by sound.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that in my work on this paper, if it's of interest to anybody, in my study of, I've read a fair amount, I would even say a lot about the study of Dickinson's prosody. And what seems most neglected is intonation, which is just a primary property of speech. And if you think of all the exclamation points that there are in Dickinson's poems, how many exclamative sentences there are there? I mean, there are millions. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it just seems to me as though intonation is the neglected component of Dickinson's prosodic music.
Thank you.
To respond to Judith and to Eliza, both really, I think, great questions. I'm sure there's people in the Zoom room who can answer the question about the historical trajectory of attitudes about suicide in 19th century better than I can. But from the little research that I did on this, my original expertise comes from 20th century poetry, and suicide to me immediately speaks to Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, whom I did a lot of work on. I've done a lot of work on over the decades, but certainly my impression is that from the beginning, I mean, that in the early 1800s, the suicide was considered, basically a moral sin, but that it had become more and more, maybe through, and I think, maybe through the influence of Shakespeare, even as Vanessa was pointing out earlier, his influence on the rising science of psychology, or what would become psychology. It had become more and more of an understanding of it as something that we would call mental illness. I think, what's fascinating to me is, Dickinson saw this boundary and just sprinted right over it again and again, which is something that we come accustomed to after reading her poems so many times. That she didn't take the normal perspective on it and accept that, but decided to push beyond it. Was she influenced by the sort of increasing sentimentality and romanticizing of suicide? I absolutely. I don't see that has to be some kind of influence on her. And yet it really seems to me that she's using it to learn, to take these sort of bold steps and see where she is. As I said in my closing remarks, I don't feel like there's nothing suicidal. I don't feel, even in these poems, she's inhabiting the emotions of it. She is seeing what gets her there, or where she lands by writing her way there. To pick up what Philip was saying earlier today, her poems are maps of thought, and where she begins the poem and where she ends it is not necessarily the same place. And I think that she uses these poems as modes of discovery. So,
well, should we let Parag close it out? I think you said you had a comment.
Okay, yeah, all I want to say is I loved both papers. Patrick, you really showed me the way in which Dickinson's poems have, taken on her concerns, as you said, with those suicides in Shakespeare. And you've totally enlightened me. I'd never thought about those poems or in the way you have. So thank you so much for your paper. And Jeffrey, that was wonderful. That was really, really brilliant. I love the way you connected form and content in both Dickinson and in Shakespeare. But also, I never ever thought about drama's vitalist expression, that long line that Dickinson then shortens as she comes along. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. And can we give one more round of applause for Patrick and Jeffrey? Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate you participating. And